When you think of the Tudor dynasty, you probably think of larger-than-life kings and queens, and all that incredible court drama. But it was also an era completely defined by rebellion. Now, we usually picture rebels as armies clashing on a battlefield, right? But under the Tudors, the whole idea of rebellion got remastered. The threat to the crown changed from open warfare into something way more subtle, and maybe, just maybe, a lot more dangerous. So let's dive in and see how.
Okay, so to really get the Tudors, you have to start with the brutal world they clawed their way out of, the Wars of the Roses. And look, this wasn't some polite political disagreement. This was a bloody, savage fight over who had the right to rule. The goal was simple and absolutely ruthless: weaken the other family's claim by killing their nobles. It was a winner-takes-all game, and if you lost, you usually lost your head too.
And that brings us right to the heart of the matter. When Henry Tudor won that decisive victory at Bosworth Field in 1485, the open warfare stopped. But was the conflict really over? Or did the battlefield for power just move? In the first few years of Tudor rule, the threat was crystal clear, and honestly pretty familiar. It was basically a continuation of the old dynastic wars, led by the die-hard supporters of the House of York. You could call them the ghosts of the White Rose.
You see, the first rebellions against Henry VII all had a very specific Yorkist flavor to them. You add everyone from Richard III's old buddies trying their luck to this creative series of pretenders popping up. But the goal was always the same, and it was a familiar one: knock this new Tudor guy off the throne and put a Yorkist back where they thought he belonged.
The whole Lambert-Simnel plot is a perfect example of this. The Yorkist strategy was to use an imposter, some kid they trained to act like a long-lost prince. But Henry VII had this brilliantly simple, totally devastating countermove. He just took the real Earl of Warwick out of the Tower of London and paraded him through the streets. I mean, it's pretty hard to convince people to fight for a fake prince when the genuine article is right there, being held by your enemy.
And don't think for a second this was just a few angry nobles. Oh no. The Yorkist threat was a full-blown international conspiracy. You had powerful people like Margaret of York, who was in Burgundy, funding mercenaries. You had high-ranking English nobles leading the armies. And then you had major European powers, France, Scotland, the Holy Roman Empire, all using these pretenders like pawns in a chess game to try and destabilize Henry VII's new kingdom.
So, you're Henry VII. You're faced with this constant, nagging dynastic threat. What do? Well, the early Tudors didn't just fight battles. They went further. They systematically took apart their rivals' power base using every tool the state could give them.
Henry VII developed this toolkit for control, and it was absolutely ruthless. If he wanted to ruin a rival, he could use something called an Act of Attainder. Basically, Parliament declares you guilty without a trial, and poof, your land and titles are gone. To keep nobles in line, he used bonds, which were pretty much a form of financial blackmail. He built up a spy network to stop plots before they even got started. And, of course, when all else failed, the executioner's axe was a very permanent solution for claimants like Warbeck and, eventually, the real Earl of Warwick.
Think about this number for a second: 46. Out of the 62 most powerful noble families in England, Henry VIII had 46 of them financially tied to him through these bonds and attainers. He wasn't just ruling the country, he was holding the purse strings of the entire aristocracy, keeping them on an incredibly tight leash. And you know what? It worked. These methods completely broke the nobility's ability to raise private armies and challenge the king head-on. By the time Henry VIII came to the throne, that old Yorkist threat was basically gone. But here's the twist. In solving the problem of dynastic war, the Tudors accidentally created a brand new kind of political battlefield. So, with the old-school dynastic threat neutralized, the fight for power didn't just vanish. It simply moved indoors, away from the open fields and into the shadowy corridors of the royal court.
Now, the key thing to get your head around here is the court faction. The best way to think of them is like political teams, but they weren't really based on ideas or policies. They were all about personal loyalty to a powerful leader. Their goal wasn't to overthrow the king, but to control who got to see him, to influence his decisions, and, critically, to get their hands on all that royal patronage. You know, the good stuff: lands, titles, and money.
This whole shift happened because the Tudors fundamentally changed how England was run. They were terrified of another civil war, so they deliberately weakened the power of the great nobles out in the regions and pulled all political authority into one place: London, right there at the royal court. Suddenly, if you wanted to be anybody, you had to be near the monarch.
This created a whole new kind of political class, and a lot of tension.
On one side, you've got the old nobility. Their power came from their ancient family names, their bloodline, and their huge estates. On the other side, you have the rise of what historians call the new men, these brilliant, often low-born administrators like Thomas Wolsey or Thomas Cromwell. Their power didn't come from their family tree. It came directly from the king's favor. And boy, did this create resentment.
Just imagine it. You're some powerful northern earl. Your family has basically ruled its corner of the country for centuries. And now you're taking orders from a butcher's son, like Wolsey? As the quote says, the traditional nobility was outraged at being bossed around by their social inferiors. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It felt like a deep social insult, and it drove a huge wedge between the court in London and the rest of the country.
So how does all this court drama connect back to rebellion? Well, popular uprisings didn't stop, but their purpose, their real goal, changed. It was no longer about replacing the monarch, it was about changing the monarch's mind, usually by getting rid of a political rival at court.
This table really lays out the new pattern of rebellion perfectly. Take the amicable grant rising in 1525. On the surface, it was about a deeply unpopular tax, but behind the scenes, nobles were letting the unrest grow just to damage their rival, Cardinal Wolsey. Or look at the huge pilgrimage of grace. Yes, it was about religion, but it was also a weapon used by one court faction to try and destroy Thomas Cromwell. From Wyatt's rebellion against Queen Mary's Spanish marriage to the northern earls rising up against William Cecil's influence, it's the same story. Popular anger was being steered and manipulated to serve the ambitions of political elites at court. And that is the fundamental shift. All these popular grievances about taxes, about religion, about foreign policy, they became weapons. They were the public face of these vicious political fights happening between court factions. Rebellion had turned into a tool for the elites to attack their rivals by proxy, using the very real anger of the people to strike at their enemies in the heart of government.
All of this leaves us with a really fascinating question about the nature of power. The first Tudors were brilliant at defeating enemies with armies. But in the process, they created a system where the greatest threat might not be a man in shining armor, but a rival whispering in the monarch's ear. So, what do you think is more dangerous to a ruler? An enemy with an army or a rival with a whisper?